Do you sense that there's like a little bit of like a gold rush mentality with some people here, where this is like get in while the getting's good,
Absolutely jump in with 2 feet into prediction markets if they have an opportunity today.
And welcome back to another edition of the Business of Betting podcast. I am your host, Jeff Edelstein. I'm a senior analyst over at ingame.com. I am joined today by senior of counsel over at Vela Wood, Peter Hammon. Peter, good morning.
Good morning, Jeff.
Bright and early for you out there in California, huh?
Bright and early Monday morning out here on the West Coast. But anything for you.
You're the first and only person who ever said it. Being out in California, I am curious. I mean, you're a gaming attorney. You've been in this space now, looks like for well over a dozen years. Do you sometimes feel like you're out, out in Siberia? Because, the whole world's been all of America's been like legalizing sports betting, some states with the iCasino. And here you are all over in California saying, hey, I'm over here, guys.
Well, I'd like to think of us as a bit of a late blooming state, Jeff, but or a never blooming state, as the case may be. But I got my start working for a company called Smarkets, which had offices in London and in Los Angeles. So I actually got super lucky because I didn't have to leave LA to really learn the sports betting exchange business. Obviously, Smarkets was and is a sports betting exchange and now a DCM applicant, actually. So I got a crash course from right here in California in, how to run what we would call an early version of a prediction market. So I got very lucky. I will say this one would be for my wife, but she gets super jealous because most of my clients are East Coast based or European based. And every day by about 2, I'm kind of winding down the work day. And so that usually means I'm on cleaning up the kitchen or making dinner duty. So it's trade-off.
It's not bad. It's not bad. So yeah, I want to go back to Smarkets actually. When you see what's happening now in the prediction market space, and you look back to your time at Smarkets and try to get the exchange betting, off the ground, what's the feeling? What do too early? Were you too early to get it? I mean, how do you reconcile it?
It's one of those classic, and Smarkets was not a startup, right? And for those who don't know the history of Smarkets, I mean, before I started working there, which was in late 2017, so pre-PASPA, but PASPA was coming down the pipe. Smarkets had a thriving challenger exchange brand to Betfair in London. And I think they still are the second largest, either them or Matchbook. I know you had Alfonso on from Matchbook a couple of weeks back, but it's still Smarkets or Matchbook that are really that second place to Betfair in the UK for the exchange market. And, for me, because I got my start there, I learned the exchange business first, really before I learned the sportsbook business. So I have always come at this industry from the perspective of a prediction market or an exchange primarily. And it really was a case at Smarkets, I think, of being too soon. And, I had another experience similar with that with Sporttrade over the last 4 or 5 years as well. But I really think if we had started the Smarkets USA journey today or a couple of years ago, it might have been a very, very different picture. And who knows, maybe they'll still get there.
Sure, absolutely. I look at Alex Kane at Sporttrade and, the Smarkets team. In my mind, I have this image of a child holding a fishing pole waiting for the divorced dad to show up to take him fishing, and they never show up. They were there, they were ready. And I feel like they're being usurped by, what's been going on with the, prediction market thing. Listen, you're a lawyer, right? And so this whole sports betting versus trading, we're not taking bets, we're not the house, how durable do you think this distinction is going to be if it actually does end up in front of, 9 people in black robes?
You could ask, I think right now, 9 different attorneys and they'd give you 9 different answers and they'd all be wrong. My attitude, I think I hate to kind of question the question here, but I think the more interesting question is, what are the arguments that prediction markets can put forward for why they should be regulated differently from sports books? Because to date, the primary arguments that I think have been rolled out are we're peer-to-peer, or in some version of we're more fair than a sports book. Neither one of those is going to be persuasive either to state gaming regulators or to the Supreme Court, because the reality is states already regulate gambling activity that's peer-to-peer. I mean, that's what poker is when you walk into a casino. That's what the early days of daily fantasy sports was actually a true peer-to-peer marketplace to go in and set a lineup and compete against someone else's lineup. And not to mention, majority of states that legalize sports betting also included exchange wagering under the definition of what is a sports bet when they legalized. So the states, whether consciously or unconsciously, had already conceptualized of regulating prediction markets on sports, or a sports betting exchange, whatever terminology you want to use. I set the politics aside, set the the war markets, or what did Tarek call them, military action markets aside for the moment. I think that the argument that I haven't seen that I would like to see be made is a more in-depth discussion from prediction markets about the business model and the revenue model. Because fundamentally, the states that legalize sports betting, even though they may have included a reference to exchange wagering in their statutes, the way that they tax and regulate sports books is completely untenable if you were going to also regulate prediction markets or sports betting exchanges. It simply can't be done. Reason being, states are taxing, the traditional DraftKings and FanDuel model as how much money did your customers lose this month? Send us a percentage of that after some reasonable deductions. That's your gaming tax rate. Well, obviously in a prediction market context or a sports betting exchange context, that number isn't going to make any sense, because whether it's a peer-to-peer wager or a peer versus a market maker wager, you're not going to have that same definition of a customer loss, or that number is just not going to look the same as it does on a FanDuel and DraftKings, because theoretically, as an exchange, you want to be as close to neutral as possible. So the states simply can't take the current iteration of statutes and directly apply them to exchanges. This is a problem that when I was with Smarkets and when I was advising Sporttrade for the last 5 or 6 years, we ran up against constantly, because we would have to do 3, 6, sometimes a year of background with a state regulator, New Jersey and Arizona. And by the way, I got to give them credit for being pretty receptive to those conversations. But it was like trying to fit a round peg in a square hole with the Sporttrade or Smarkets business model, fitting it into the existing definition of state sports betting and how to tax and how to regulate that activity. So I would love to see, Tarek and Shane and others take that argument and run with it a little bit more than just saying, oh, we're peer-to-peer, therefore it's not sports betting. Because that's the reality is that's not true. It's never been true. And I don't think that argument is going to be persuasive. And for me personally, I would like to see a thriving prediction market or sports betting exchange market, because it's good for me, it's good for my clients. So I would like to see this runway last longer than the next couple of years.
Now, and I know I don't want to step on your toes here, concerning your clients and stuff, but for the established sports books who are now trying to get into the space, DraftKings, FanDuel, then you have the Fanatics and Underdog, where do you think their best play is? Is it fighting hard to tooth and nail against it, which they're not doing? Is it, jumping into the deep end with them? Is it trying to get that, casual customer that they prove to be good at? I guess what I'm driving at, let's say this all works out. There's no way that there's 4 dozen prediction market companies, battling for the dollar, right? So if you're established and you're already out there, how do you now climb this hill and try to knock basically what amounts to Kalshi off of it?
I mean, Kalshi's got a pretty good head start now, as you know. But I think the answer is going to be different for some of those names that you just described. So, because I got my start in this business in-house and not necessarily as an outside counsel, I learned the business first and did a ton of business development work early on in my career. What I see happening here, you mentioned 4 dozen DCMs or 4 dozen exchanges. If that ends up being true, and I think you're probably right in the next year or so, then the real value accrual or value driver is going to be at the layer below the exchange. So these are going to be your market makers, become incredibly valuable because of there's going to be scarcity of market makers to meet the demands of 48 or 50 exchanges when liquidity is key. I mean, liquidity is king here. Whichever one or handful of those exchanges has the best liquidity, the deepest liquidity, they're going to be able to, acquire customers and keep those customers from churning out to another exchange. So market maker layer, critical. So I would be, if I'm one of those companies you just mentioned, I would be thinking about setting up a separate entity to just do market making. You see DraftKings is already doing this. They're already hiring trading roles. But if I'm Fanatics, I'd be doing the exact same thing. The other layer where I think you're going to see value, given how many exchanges there are going to be, is the customer acquisition layer. So that would be your FCMs, your future commission merchants, all new language to me. But basically, think of them as, in our traditional sports betting parlance, like your marketing affiliates, although they do a heck of a lot more in the prediction market context than they do in the sports betting universe. So this is going to be, if you're Fanatics, for example, I really think for them, I would just be an FCM. And I know that's how they initially started maybe a year ago, but now it looks like they're doing a full pivot to DCM. And frankly, if I were them, I would focus on how can I funnel my existing Fanatics sports betting users, as well as this giant database of customers that I have from the retail sales market that I have, where I know exactly what my customers' favorite teams are. I know exactly where they're based in terms of which state, and I know how old they are too. I would be thinking very seriously about whether, if I'm Fanatics, I could become the most important FCM in this universe. And I could basically control the flow, like Robinhood was doing last year, of which exchanges get these orders and which exchanges actually end up with liquidity. If you, like Robinhood, can control that market, then you're going to make a boatload of money without any of the risk of actually running the exchange itself.
Going back to the customer acquisition thing for a second, I'm in New Jersey. I mean, I've noticed there's some like marketing going on with Kalshi. That's about it. Boots on the ground in California, like what are you seeing as far as like marketing and advertising when it comes to all this right now?
I don't know if it's just my personal experience because I listen to so many freaking sports podcasts all day, but I can't avoid it, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or, when I put on YouTube, every other ad is for Kalshi. You don't see the same for Polymarket, but specifically Kalshi out here in California, it is impossible to avoid. And I was down in Texas in March and April. It was the same thing, which makes me think, understandably so, they are spending the majority or a significant plurality of marketing dollars in those two states, which makes perfect sense.
What's interesting to me, I mean, obviously what's interesting to everybody is like, it's so weird. It's like we're talking about two different things, prediction markets and sports books, going after kind of the same customer on, parallel, but never the twain shall meet tracks, and there's plenty of people who are trying to, market makers, I'm sure, are one of them, but there's plenty of people that are like at 9:10 a.m., they're in the sportsbook streets. At 9:12 a.m., they're in the prediction market streets. At 9:13, they got 3 tabs open. They're everywhere. How do you balance that? What's your role in helping out there?
Yeah, I actually saw a version of this question bouncing around LinkedIn over the weekend. Someone was asking for, legal or consulting help on how to set up a market making business with employees in the States, but we want to trade on prediction markets here domestically, prediction markets internationally, because obviously you have the Polymarket international version, as well as a ton of offshore prediction markets that shall go nameless for now. Plus, you have the domestic US sports betting universe, where market makers oftentimes play a different role, which is as a sports betting supplier, sometimes providing not liquidity, but providing advice on odds and risk management to sportsbooks. So one of the things that I've been working with for basically since early 2025 is how to advise clients on managing the risk, both the legal and regulatory risk of trying to operate both in the regulated domestic sports betting universe, as well as the domestic prediction market universe, as well as oftentimes a significant international prediction market or international sports betting or market making business. And the answer is going to be different for each client because the risk reward profile is going to be totally different depending on the size of the organization. So you might have somebody who is now running their own version of a market making business out of their garage that didn't have that opportunity 2 years ago, versus some pretty large 50 to 100 employee organizations with 35 to 40 traders who were previously just working with fantasy sports companies, maybe booking those large 15 leg parlays on DFS sites, or working with sportsbooks to manage risk in the background, that are now presented with this incredible opportunity of, hey, I don't just have to be a risk manager and take a small percentage. I can now market make or trade on these venues and keep the majority of those profits for myself. So that's tremendous opportunity for these companies. And oftentimes, without giving out too much free advice, there's basically two risk profiles. One is that legal regulatory risk. The other is an operational risk, because you have to manage your relationships with your pre-existing clients like sportsbooks or daily fantasy sports sites, who obviously understand what's going on, and they don't necessarily want to see you splitting your time, but also to be able to manage those relationships with regulators and help those regulators to understand what you're doing or what you're not doing and why. So that has been a huge chunk of my day-to-day business, is trying to kind of keep all those plates spinning, because again, for these market makers, it is just a tremendous opportunity right now to make a ton of money in prediction markets. And I think some folks were a bit slow to adopt or adapt to that, but people are really catching up now.
You really seem to have a very like cellular level understanding of all this. And I'm going to ask you later about your background, because this is all like, this is where you've been spent your entire career. But do you sense that there's like a little bit of like a gold rush mentality with some people here, where this is like, get in while the getting's good, because you don't know how long it's going to last?
I understand it. It reminds me a lot of, it's funny. I started in 2017, so 9 years ago, really 8.5 years ago. And I feel like I've lived 3 or 4 careers already because I started pre-PASPA, then you had PASPA, then we had the evolution of daily fantasy sports happening at the same time as states were rolling out online sports betting for the first time. Then you had the sweepstakes craze from a couple of years ago. And now, again, I started with exchange wagering. Now we're somehow all the way back to exchange wagering or prediction markets. So I do have a little bit of a more 30,000 foot view perspective, because I've seen these different online gaming niches rise and fall rapidly and sometimes without warning, particularly in the sweepstakes context, that happened pretty quickly. I have to be, part of my job is to look at the crystal ball and help clients to understand what are the probabilities of what could happen. And while I do advise clients to absolutely jump in with 2 feet into prediction markets if they have an opportunity today, because otherwise you might be missing out on a generational opportunity that's not going to come around again if the Supreme Court case doesn't go their way. But also to do it with a perspective that in 18 months to 2 years, you might have to walk into your partners, your sportsbook partners, your DFS partners, your state regulators, and be prepared with a mea culpa. I look at folks like Profit and Novig and Sporttrade, that even DraftKings and FanDuel, that are fully now embedded in the prediction market industry. And, particularly for those first 3 that I named, I don't think there's any going back. And by the way, I think they're making the right decision in terms of risk and reward. But there is an understanding, I think, within those organizations that this is it. There is not really a pivot back to traditional sports betting after you have completely left that industry to start over in prediction markets. So if at all possible, I'm advising clients right now to make as much money as you can for as long as prediction markets on sports are an opportunity, but keep one eye open, or keep one eye on the existing, long-standing businesses that you've been running in the US for, in some cases, 10 years, because it's very possible 2 years from now that we'll be back where we were pre-2024.
I'm starting to get a sense, and I'm seeing it. I've seen it written more than once. I've seen it tweeted more than once. And like every day, there's another story about prediction markets and a major media outlet. Like, it's huge, obviously. Do you think it's possible? And I'm not going to ask you to put yourself in the mind of a Supreme Court justice, but are we like getting to moving towards like too big to fail territory?
I don't think so, because to me, the question is so fundamental that I'm not sure too big to fail is going to matter to the Supreme Court, because the question is really not whether, for example, the CFTC can regulate the activity. I think they could if they had the proper staffing and the right mindset about it. I think certainly different past versions of the CFTC have both considered regulating the activity, and thought really critically and thoughtfully about it. So I think the question is just fundamentally whether the states first get to decide what is sports betting or the federal government does. And I don't think too big to fail is necessarily going to matter. And by the way, I think part of the reason why you're seeing Kalshi in particular do so much publicity about the fact that the percentage of sports volume is shrinking rapidly. Now, I think you can question, how they arrive at that number, but every week you do see posts from Kalshi really, really referencing the fact that their percentage of sports volume is being reduced, and politics, crypto, other miscellaneous markets are taking up a larger share. The reason I think that they're doing that is twofold. One, I think it helps their case potentially in front of the Supreme Court that they're not just a sports book in disguise. But I also think in the court of public opinion and for their investors, they do need to show that there are other fundamental reasons to have prediction markets other than just for folks to bet on sports. So you can see that they're already either preparing that argument or potentially, if you wanted to be really cynical, preparing for a world without sports on prediction markets.
I mean, that was the whole original pitch was, this is for economic price discovery. And, and then they really, I've seen, they've really stepped back from if the Reds game gets rained out, that's because to me and to so many other people, I think that is the one sticking point to all this is yes, I know it's different, but it's not, if I'm betting the Giants, I'm betting the Giants, whether I'm doing it on a sports book or on Kalshi, it's for me, for the end user, there is no difference,
By the way, I think that's smart from them to stop hammering that argument, because it's really easy for folks even outside of our industry to see through that argument. Because I think, forget about the law, forget about the regulation for now. I think most people, when they think about gambling, they don't think about a revenue model or a business model. They think about what is the customer, the person placing the bet doing? What are they risking? And fundamentally, that is the same whether you're doing it on a prediction market or you're doing it on a sports book. Now, I think there is some nuance there. Obviously, you have a wider array of cash out options, a wider array of hedging options that, we don't need to get too in the weeds there. But the reality is, at consumer level, the activity looks and feels almost exactly the same, whether you're trading on a prediction market for sports or betting on a sportsbook, which is why I really think that the folks at Kalshi and Polymarket focusing more on other parts of the argument, like the revenue model, like the business model, the institutional adoption, is a smarter argument. For those of you to go back into history books for just a second, Jeff, the real nerds out there will remember in 2021, 2022, there was a company called ErisX. I think it was represented by IFRA that applied to the CFTC to do sports prediction markets. Specifically, they wanted to offer hedges to, I think it was basically just team owners and then folks that owned real estate directly around arenas. And it was never formally rejected by the CFTC because they pulled the application before a decision could get made. But you can go back and read, the thought process there. So this concept of economic hedging on sports has already, that argument's been made. It's not new. And the CFTC, different version of the CFTC, has already quietly rejected that. So I just don't think making that argument, if you're Kalshi or Polymarket, is going to have any legs.
And I'm going to ask you about your beginnings in a minute. I keep threatening to, but again, you've seen all this. People like myself, who have to put, pen to paper for a living, have really I've gone far and wide in trying to compare all this to, poker and, that ending and DFS and all that and sweepstakes and all that. Where are the similarities when it comes to this, and what are the big differences, from a legal perspective?
Yeah, I think the obvious similarity is the peer-to-peer nature. So just like when you go play either online poker or if you walk into a casino these days, there's going to be poker tables and the casino is taking a rake. Rake meaning basically commission on every hand played. Basically, this is what prediction markets are doing is they're not necessarily charging you vig on the bet itself, but they, even in the early days when I was with Smarkets, we might, for example, charge a commission on winning bets, but not on losers. So you could come theoretically bet on Smarkets in London, and if you deposited $100,000 and you lost every single bet you ever placed, then technically we as Smarkets might not have ever made a single dollar off of you, because every dollar you bet was probably against another peer in the market or against a market maker. And all that money would accrue to those folks. We would take nothing. We would take a percentage from the market maker who won the bet against you or the peer that won the bet against you. But from you, we might not get anything technically. That poker model is very, very similar to the prediction market model. But I also want to be clear that, Kalshi and Polymarket may not have been tracking the evolution of Novig and Profit and Sporttrade for the last 5, 6, or 7 years, but we've been essentially doing a version of prediction markets on sports since 2018, when I think Jason Strauss used to host this show. But when we got our first sports betting license in Indiana and Colorado, that was 2018, 2019. So the model has been around. It's just been called different things. It used to be called exchange wagering, sometimes called sports betting exchange, sometimes called peer-to-peer wagering. There was a company in Tennessee, I think, called Zen Sports that was doing regulated sports wagering as a true peer-to-peer marketplace with no market makers involved. It didn't work, but the concept has been done before and done here in the US. It's not a new idea necessarily. What's new is the regulatory application and the regulatory arguments that are being put forth. And those, by the way, I am jealous of the chutzpah, because I would, if for example, sometimes for the last 18 months, I've laid awake kind of kicking myself for, not basically making the same bet that Tarek did since 2022, because companies I was working for and working with all had the technology and the chops and the market making relationships to do what Kalshi and Polymarket are doing now. In some cases, like in Sporttrade's case and in Smarket's case, they have applications out to the CFTC now to become a DCM. But I'm kicking myself for not saying, hey, why don't we set aside a couple $1 million to just, I can run it on the side. And, I will always have that thought in the back of my head of, why didn't myself or folks like myself see this? And I think that's, part of the job. You said you kept threatening to kind of ask me how I got my start, but the way that I think about the job that I do now, which both in the formal outside counsel role that I have at Vela Wood, but also, I have a consulting business that I run to work with clients on these more thorny issues of risk and reward that aren't necessarily legal questions. And I think it's been interesting to watch the sort of emotional evolution of folks like myself over the last 18 months from kind of, the 5 stages of grief, right? The initial one is, hey, no way this is legal, which, by the way, I try not to take approaches like that, because I think for consultants and attorneys in the space, you have to have a little bit of humility, because when we are advising clients, sometimes we are going to get it wrong. And you have to be able to look at each new problem, each new business model with fresh eyes, and be able to say, all right, what do we think the world is going to look like in 18 months to 2 years? And why might this time it be different? Because again, like I said, I do think, again, I would love to give Tarek truth serum and say, hey, if you thought this was going to be legal, why were you not offering sports prediction markets in 2022? Why wasn't that the pitch to, I think Sequoia was the initial investor in Kalshi. Why was that not part of the pitch deck? And by the way, it is completely fine, and I think appropriate for those businesses to evolve as the political and regulatory situation evolves as well. I think you have to stay in front. So it's incumbent upon us as, you as a reporter, and then me as a, sort of a boots on the ground problem solver, basically, to keep an open mind. Because if you would have asked me about this 2 years ago, and people did, we said, no way. Don't waste the application fee. That don't spend the 500 grand for the application and to hire the law firm to help you apply to the CFTC. It's not worth it.
A lot can change. Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I picture like two Kalshi employees like walking in the hallway, one with chocolate and one with peanut butter, knocking into each other. Like, hey, we should offer sports betting. All right, my big threat. So I find this fascinating to me. When you go on your LinkedIn page, founder and president, but the founder that I really want to sink in on of the UCLA Gaming Law Association at UCLA Law School. This is back in 2015.
Now you're aging me. You're aging me, Jeff.
No, I'm not, because I'm the old one here. 2015 to me I can tell you, it's like breakfast to me, 2015. But for you, it's a long time ago. You're a law student at UCLA, and you decide to start the UCLA Gaming Law Association. I can't imagine that you would have thought that you were thinking then about sweepstakes, about PASPA, about Kalshi, about any of this stuff. But you clearly there was something knocking around your brain that said, I'm interested in gaming law. But I can't imagine, did you have that crystal ball? Did you see, how far and wide this could end up? Or did you see yourself sitting at the Caesar Steakhouse, talking to vice presidents, of brick and mortar for your career? So I'm curious, well, what did you see? What provoked you to do this?
So I've always been interested in the gambling business. I remember even in 6th, 7th grade, my buddies and I got not suspended, but whatever the version of detention was in 2006, because we were collecting money from kids for March Madness bracket during class. So I've always been interested in this business. And I think on my 18th birthday, we all went to the local Indian casino in Sacramento. But no, so what really sparked my curiosity, it's a classic law school story. My mom's a judge. I always wanted to be a district attorney or a trial attorney, right? My vision for my career was, I'm going to go be a district attorney somewhere, make a name for myself, and then become a big name defense attorney doing big trials, right? Because I'm a super competitive person and I have a bit of an ego. So the idea of standing up there in the room and all eyes on me was very appealing, just being honest. So then I did it for a couple of summers and realized, this is a little bit too, there's just not enough entrepreneurial spirit here at the DA's office, which of course, right? I should have known better. But right around that same time, 2015 basically, was when DraftKings and FanDuel, the early version of DFS, really, really started to take off. And that was the summer and fall where you could not avoid DK and FD ads. Didn't matter where you were, couldn't avoid it. And I remember playing in law school, I'd have my lineup going, we had night classes and be doing my lineup, watching Monday Night Football, whatever. And it just hit me one day because I said, well, why am I allowed to bet $100 on this, fantasy lineup, but I can't actually bet on the outcome of the game? Or if I want to bet on the outcome of the game, I've got to drive 400 miles east through the desert to get to the Nevada border. So just for the kind of the future lawyer in me, the future kind of entrepreneurial guy in me said, something has to change. If this DFS, if this DraftKings early DK and FD product is this popular, surely something has to change with respect to true sports betting. And so that's what caused me to start the UCLA Gaming Law Association, which was really, as I tell people now, just an excuse to have an email address that said President UCLA Gaming Law Association. Because the reality was no one at DraftKings or FanDuel was going to answer an email from some random law school kid. But if it says President Gaming Law Association, they might take my call, right? That was basically the goal. And it worked. We had some really, really interesting speakers come and talk to us at UCLA. And actually, one of my professors that knew I was into this stuff in 2016 pulled me aside after class one day and said, hey, one of my buddies is an American guy that I went to school with 15 years ago. He's an American guy that moved to London and started a sportsbook. Now, he didn't really know the terminology. He was talking about Jason Trost and Smarkets because Jason was an American guy that moved to London because he was desperate to start a prediction market and couldn't do it in the US at the time. So that's how I got my first job. I was introduced to Jason. Him and I got along and we saw the future in a little bit of the same way. And he hired me right out of law school. So I never I always joke with folks, I never had to be a real lawyer because I think my official title was like head of business development and, government relations or something like that. So that's how I got my start in this business, somewhat by accident. But I do think, I sat there and looked at a product, an early version of DraftKings and FanDuel and said, yeah, there's something more here, or this is so popular that something has to change. And I made that bet, I guess. It turned out to be a good one.
It is interesting. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it like that before. But if DFS gets slapped down like it almost did, like would we be where we're at today?
No, I really think no. I think if the states had won the argument against DFS in what was that? That was like 2015, 2016 when they did, we had court cases all over the country. I really don't think you ever get past that because I don't know that there's the impetus or the sort of the groundswell from the general population. I don't think the general population ever gets as comfortable with having money on sporting events on like a daily basis, or for that to be such a part of American sports media coverage, right? I mean, these days, basically, the entire American sports media ecosystem is propped up by DFS, sportsbook prediction markets, and some sweepstakes stuff a couple years ago. So, I don't think we get there. So I'm glad that worked out, because otherwise I'd be a DA somewhere in some backwater county in California.
But I guess also from an investor perspective, on the heels of poker getting outlawed, if DFS got outlawed, I mean, you just might be a little bit more gun shy on where you're going to deposit your, tens of millions of dollars and, IPO money or whatever.
That investor money was really slow to trickle in. I don't know if you remember this basically, but there was not a lot of VC money in online sports betting until like 2020, right? When cash was basically free because of interest rates. Like I remember trying to raise at Smarkets in 18 and 19 to pursue the US opportunity. It was huge. At the time, we all thought a huge, massive opportunity. We didn't at that time anticipate just how complicated the state by state regulatory model was going to be and how difficult it would be under the state by state regulatory model to actually turn a profit. But yeah, VCs were still scared at that time in 18 and 19, at least American VCs, because it was so new. And it was only when money was free, everyone was home, and the only thing you do was bet on sports, that the money started to really pile in.
Another boots on the ground question for you. We all know the troubles and the problems and the reasons why California has not been able to get legalized sports betting off the ground, or for that matter, online casino. Do you see, and I almost feel as prediction markets, or if prediction markets become the law of the land, it'll almost be too late. But have you seen any thawing of the permafrost on, the 106, I believe is the number of tribes and, the people of the state? And like, is there even a horizon out there?
So again, I hope to represent some of these tribes in the future. So I'm going to be careful with what I say here. I have been impressed with the level of solidarity on this question. let's say that. And the level of intellectual consistency here, because for 10 years, California tribes have said, if we do it, we're going to control the flow. And if we do it, it's going to start with retail or in person first, and only in person first. And now here we are in 2026, and that is still the party line. So I think at some point, those of us who are advising companies, or, like you, tracking the progress, I think we're going to have to start believing them when they say that, because I think they're not going to move off of that position. And by the way, I understand it. So the thing to understand about California Indian casinos and the market here, that I think if you don't live here, you don't understand, is geography. This is a massive state. The Indian casinos are largely not anywhere close to the major metropolitan centers. Like most of them are in the boonies, or like the closest one to us, I live in LA. The closest one is probably a 2-hour drive. I've either got to go north to Santa Barbara and go to Chumash. I've got to go east to San Manuel, or I've got to go south, like down east of San Diego. It's 2 hours from LA to get to an Indian casino. And so if online sports betting is legalized here, No one is ever going to go to an Indian casino to book a bet. It's just
Right.
not going to happen. So that's the thing I think folks need to understand about California geography and how it impacts this discussion. What I do think is interesting about prediction markets as it relates to this discussion is, look, I've never represented tribes that, I've had good relationships with some of them here in California, but I've never formally worked for them. But the other thing to understand about tribal and state relationships is everything is done by compact, which is basically a written agreement, a contract between a tribe or a tribal casino and the state. And so that means the states and the Indian casinos are basically in constant conversation and negotiation with one another. It's not like that with other gambling businesses. With other gambling businesses, there's a set rule or a set law that has the tax rate, has the compliance rules you have to follow, the types of gambling you can offer, and that's it. That's the law. You can come in and you can leave, but the law is not really going to change. But for tribal casinos and the relationship with the states, it's constantly changing, right? The tax rate moves all the time. The size of the casinos change all the time. The different rights that the tribal gaming entities have changes all the time. So I think what's interesting, if I'm a tribal attorney or tribal counsel right now, prediction markets are great for me because, for example, in California, all of a sudden it's gone from a situation where California is guaranteeing tribes sovereignty over all aspects of online sports betting, right? Basically, the state has to guarantee that the tribes have a monopoly over it. Well, now if I'm a tribe, I can say, well, hold on, Gavin Newsom, look at my phone. Here's Kalshi. I'm betting on the Dodgers game tonight. So what's going on there? So if I'm headed into a negotiation with the state of California right now, I basically have all the leverage because I'm saying you as a state are not holding up your end of the bargain because you have not managed to boot these guys out of California, sort of like Nevada did. And so now basically you're violating the terms of our contract. And so I need something in return. So I think for tribes in California and nationwide, really, the sports prediction markets boom is giving them all a ton of leverage. And I will be curious to see what they do with it. I think you and I talked on the phone a couple of months back, and we were talking about kind of my tinfoil hat conspiracy theory, which is basically that the prediction markets boom on sports and the current world where there's uncertainty around how long it's going to last is kind of perfect for everybody, right? Because that uncertainty works. This is my example really for the tribes, is it gives the tribes leverage in those negotiations, and it gives them a boogeyman to unite against that they didn't really have. They had it with sweepstakes a couple of years ago, but now sweepstakes is shut down. This is the next one that they can go to the states and they can say, hey, what are you guys doing for us here?
But the state, I mean, even if the state can do something and kick out Kalshi Polymarket, kick out prediction markets, that could just be very quickly upended by a Supreme Court decision, obviously. So as far as the negotiation level goes, I mean, from an outsider's outsider, I'm an outsider on all of this. But it really does seem to me that, like, if I'm a tribe, I don't need it. So I might as well hold out for the best deal I can get in the end. I don't need it. And two, this is like, this is Wikipedia Jeff here, thinking he's smart about something. But I just feel like, the typical American mindset is faster, quicker now. And it seems like the Native American mindset is not that.
Understandably so, right? Because the reality is, if other than the couple of biggest tribes in California, you're talking San Manuel, for example, all the other gaming tribes, even if online sports betting was legal today, and the rules were, for example, let's say, like, I think eventually where we'll end up is that, much like in other states, a domestic or international sportsbook that wants to come in and offer their brand has to do it in partnership with a local Native American tribe. All right, let's say that happens in California in like 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Regardless of what happens with prediction markets, there's not, there's 70 something gaming tribes in California. There's not 78 competitive, marketable sports books or prediction markets that can fill partnerships with each gaming tribe, which means if you end up with not DraftKings, not Fanatics, not FanDuel, not Kalshi or Polymarket, if you don't end up with one of the big partnerships, then you're screwed. You're left out. You're not making any money. And for those casinos also,
not to disparage the technical staff that they have now, but, the engineering talent needed to build a sports book or a prediction market from scratch is a hell of a lot different than the engineering talent needed to keep the lights on for a, retail or in-person brick and mortar casino. There's just not, they'd have to think in 10-year increments if they were serious about creating a competitive online sports betting product. And, some of the larger ones like San Manuel have been thinking about that problem for a couple of years now, but, there's not like, it would be 10 years, I think, before there you had 20 or 30 California tribes ready to launch an online sports book. It's a hard business.
All right, last question for you here before I let you go. I'm not a soccer guy. I'm just not a soccer fan. Are you repping somebody here right now with your kit? Is that a kit?
Yeah, no. So this is my wife and I did our honeymoon in New Zealand, and so we had to come home with some rugby jerseys.
Okay, so it's a rugby. Okay.
This is the Three Lions, or this is the British, the rugby, the old school British jersey. We did come home with some All Black skiers as well.
So now I've just proven that not only do I not know much about soccer, I also know not much about rugby.
Hey, I don't know anything about it. I just know it's a cool shirt. That's all I know.
Peter Hammon, thank you so much for joining me today. Very illuminating. We'll do this again.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Great to talk to you.